Well, I'd just like to welcome everyone to our evening's lecture. It is a pleasure to have all of you here. My name is Neil Saphir. I'm the director of the library, and we have the pleasure of welcoming not only our speaker for tonight's event, David Bell, but also a group of scholars from the US and France who are here as part of a two-day symposium called on the life and career of Gilbert Chinard, who, for those of you who don't know, was an important figure in French and American and Franco-American scholarship in the first half of the 20th century. And it's especially poignant to have this symposium, which is a very informal symposium gathering here at the JCB, because this was one of Gilbert Chinard's most important stops. It was one of his first stops here in the United States. And after spending a couple of days talking about his career, we think that it was perhaps one of the crucial places in which he developed a lot of his ideas about what America was and about what its role in his own world could be. So that is the broader context for this evening's lecture. And just a few brief words about David Bell, who is Sidney and Ruth Lapidus Professor in the Era of North Atlantic Revolutions in the Department of History at Princeton University. I have known David since my first day of graduate school, actually before my first day of graduate school, when I went to visit the Johns Hopkins University, and he was a faculty member there and someone to whom who I had applied to work with. And David, I think, his career is extraordinarily rich. And it would take me much longer than the 45 minutes that we have allotted him to give his lecture for me to even begin to recount the contours. But I think there are basically three things that one can say about David. In the first instance, he is an extraordinarily gifted researcher. His books, which include a number focused on France, 18th century France, titled Lawyers and Citizens, the Cult of the Nation in Early Modern France, which takes a broader scope, the First Total War, which was published more recently and reached a much broader audience. All three of those books, which were landmarks in their field, were also prize-winning books. So he is one of these scholars who sets up a very difficult model for himself, which is every time he publishes a book, it wins one of the discipline's most important prizes. So his scholarship is vast and important. I would also say that the second thing I would say is that in a nation that severely lacks for public intellectuals, David Bell is really one of the most extraordinary ones, in the sense that he, from a very, very early point in his career, was able to translate the somewhat abstruse language of the academy into language that well-educated people, at the very least, could very clearly understand. He has published not only in the New Republic and online venues, but in a wide range of magazines, and it was something that I admired about him from a very early point when I read his scholarship, his ability to express these ideas very clearly. The final thing that I would say is that, and this is very much from my own experience, he is an absolutely extraordinary advisor. He is somebody who takes the work of his students extremely seriously, even when they run the risk of sliding slightly outside of his area of expertise. But I could always count on him to offer extremely intelligent and helpful comments. I know my experience is not unique because he has done this with all of the students that he has worked with, as well as other students who are not his own students. So for me, he's been a model of collegiality and generosity in a field that often suffers the lack of both. So I appreciate that very much. It gives me great pleasure to have him here as part of this symposium to present a lecture entitled George Washington and the Two Corsicans, which is part of his current book project in progress. And just want to say thank you and welcome to the JCB.
Well, thank you so much, Neil. That is one introduction I will never, ever live up to, but thank you very much. It is really a delight to be here this evening, and I'm grateful to Neil and also to Owen Stanwood and Bertrand van Rynbeck and the other participants in this symposium for really just a wonderful day of discussions around Gilbert Chénard, and for organizing all of this and bringing us all here to this wonderful place, to the JCB. Just a couple of sort of words before I sort of plunge into the subject here. As you understand from Neil, I'm not actually a historian of the United States or the American Revolution, so I'm sort of trespassing on this territory, but I will count on the Americanists who are here to set me right when, I won't even say if, but when I go wrong. The talk is not going to be, of course, about Gilbert Chénard, the man we've been spending time discussing today. I do think it falls sort of squarely into the category of subjects that interested Gilbert Chénard. I feel a sort of kinship to Gilbert Chénard in a small way because he taught at Johns Hopkins and then at Princeton, and I sort of followed that itinerary myself. One of the small delights actually of teaching at Princeton is that occasionally I will go down deep into the bowels of Firestone Library and I'll take out a book, usually something to do with French and American relations in the 18th century, and I'll find that actually from the card that the last person to borrow that book was Gilbert Chénard sometime in the 1930s or 1940s. One of the nice things about libraries is the cards keep these nice records like that. So it's really a pleasure to be here at this symposium today. Now, actually, in 1940, Gilbert Chénard published a lovely little book which was entitled George Washington as the French Knew Him. And what it was basically a collection of documents. It collected a very wide range of contemporary French accounts of Washington, both from eyewitnesses, particularly officers who served in the American Revolution, and also from admirers who never left France and never met him. It presented Washington in what, for Americans, was quite an unfamiliar light. And in this talk today, I want to try to do something a little bit similar. There is, of course, a mammoth industry, sort of scholarly and popular industry, devoted to George Washington in this country, quite justifiably so. In it, George Washington is very often presented as a kind of uniquely, quintessentially American figure, maybe aristocratic, but aristocratic in a very Virginian manner. And I want to look today at the making of Washington's reputation, particularly his political reputation. And I want to suggest that if we want to understand this phenomenon fully, we actually have to see it in the prism of a broad Enlightenment Atlantic political culture, to place it into a story which really begins in Europe and develops all across the Atlantic world, which is actually the subject of this book project of mine. And more specifically, we have to place George Washington into the company of two Corsicans. I'm sure you can guess whom at least one of those Corsicans was. I will come to the other one in a few minutes. But to start, I want to jump right into the middle of the American Revolution, more specifically to a session of the Continental Congress in February of 1777. It was soon after George Washington had won two great victories at Trenton and at Princeton, and Congress was debating whether to increase his power by granting him the right to name other generals. The motion was opposed by none other than John Adams. And Adams said the following, and I'm quoting, "I've been distressed to see some of our members disposed to idolize an image which their own hands have molded. I speak here of the superstitious veneration which is paid to General Washington." And the motion failed. And I want particularly, and it's an interesting statement, Adams was one of the people certainly very responsible for making Washington the commander-in-chief, but now Adams was speaking of the superstitious veneration paid to Washington. And I want to particularly pause on Adams's use of the word idolize, because here he is a biblically literate product of Protestant Massachusetts, and using the word in relation of the idol in relation to George Washington was no accident. And in fact, Adams would develop the theme. The next October, he'd come back to it in a letter to his close friend, the Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush. Now it was just after the Battle of Saratoga, another great American victory. And Adams quipped in his letter to Rush that it was a good thing Washington hadn't been there. He said, otherwise, and I quote, idolatry and adulation would have been unbounded, so excessive as to endanger our liberties. But now at least we can allow a certain citizen, Washington, to be wise, virtuous, and good without thinking him a deity or a savior. So you can see when Adams is using kind of religious vocabulary about Washington, idol, deity, savior, I mean, there's something to this. And in fact, John Adams and Benjamin Rush would continue to reflect on this same theme for a very, very long time indeed. If we jump, I won't go through the entire correspondence here, it would take a very long time, but we could jump ahead all the way to 1807, for instance, when Adams wrote a blisteringly funny letter to Benjamin Rush, well known to Americanists, in which he reflected upon George Washington's 10 principal talents. The first 4 of these were a handsome face, tall stature, an elegant form, and graceful attitudes and movements. And then we could jump even further to 1812 and see Adams again in a letter to Rush reflecting rather more seriously on this theme. And here it's worth quoting Adams again at length. I'm quoting, "So the great character," he's referring to Washington, "was a character of convention. There was a time when statesmen and officers of the army expressly agreed to blow the trumpets of panegyric in concert, to cover and dissemble all faults and errors, to make that character popular and fashionable with all parties in all places, and with all persons as a center of union, as the central stone in the geometrical arch. There you have the revelation," said Adams, "of the whole mystery. Something of the same kind has occurred in France and has produced a Napoleon and his empire." And just to finish on this theme, later that year, that same year, it was Benjamin Rush's turn in a letter to Adams, and he reflected on, and I'm quoting again, "the idolatrous worship paid to the name of General Washington by all classes and nearly all parties of our citizens." Now, it would be very easy, actually, to write off these comments as the products of little more than personal jealousy and resentment. John Adams, short, tubby, fussy, distinctly uncharismatic, could be quite prone to jealousy, especially when it came to tall, graceful Virginians. It could not have helped that when Abigail Adams first met George Washington, she basically collapsed into a little puddle of admiration, was left starstruck, misquoting Dryden to her husband, where she wrote to him, quote, "He's a temple, sacred by birth and built by hands divine," wrote Abigail Adams about George Washington. Benjamin Rush, for his part, clashed repeatedly with Washington when he was serving as a medical officer in the American Army. He had a part in the so-called Conway Cabal against Washington in 1777-8. He was publicly humiliated when stinging criticism he had written about Washington became known to Washington. Also, both Adams and Rush had a background as, classical Republicans who had a deep Whig suspicion of standing armies, and they disapproved of George Washington's desire to model the Continental Army after European militaries. But I do think that at least when it comes to the first few years of the American Revolution, there is a case for taking Adams's and Rush's views somewhat seriously. These views of Washington as an idol, as a character of convention. We have to remember that the first months following the Declaration of Independence were not exactly ones of unbroken military triumph for the newborn United States. At the end of August 1776, the British routed the Americans at the Battle of Long Island. The defeat convinced most observers that American troops could not possibly hold their own in pitched battles against British regulars. 2.5 months later, the last American units withdrew from Manhattan, right underneath what is now the George Washington Bridge, leaving the vital city of New York in British hands. The American forces subsequently lost most of their strength as soldiers reached the end of their enlistment periods and returned home. By late November of 1776, a British lieutenant named Francis Rawdon Hastings was writing to a Boston loyalist, and I quote, about the Americans, "Their army is broken all to pieces. The spirit of their leaders is also broken. I think one may venture to pronounce that it is well nigh over with them. And a month later, Tom Paine put out the first issue of The American Crisis, which opened with the famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." We also have to remember that George Washington himself was not exactly without responsibility for some of these setbacks, and he did not at this point in history exactly have a sterling military record. Back in 1754, he had done as much as anybody else to trigger the French and Indian Wars when his detachment of Virginia militia and Indian auxiliaries opened fire on French soldiers in the Ohio Valley, setting hostilities in motion. There quickly followed his own humiliating defeat and capture by the French at Fort Necessity. A year later, he did help save the remnants of Braddock's army from complete destruction, but that episode was anything but a victory. Even his first principal achievement after taking command of the Revolutionary Army, namely forcing the British to withdraw from Boston in the late winter of 1776, really only succeeded as a series of uncontrollable events, including a storm, kept the British from interfering with his fortification of Dorchester Heights. And during the Battle of Long Island in August 76, he committed many serious tactical blunders. This was not, in other words, yet the Washington who, if we follow Gordon Wood, present here tonight, was the only American with the stature possibly to unite the new nation around the federal Constitution. Washington was not yet there. And indeed, as one might expect, during these early desperate moments of the Revolution, some on the American side were very quick to blame those in charge of military operations. After the Battle of Long Island, John Adams wrote to his wife, "In general, our generals were out-generaled." 5 days after the last American troops fled across the Hudson into New Jersey, Adjutant General Joseph Reed wrote to General Charles Lee, portraying Washington in scathing terms. I'm quoting, "Oh, an indecisive mind is one of the greatest misfortunes that can befall an army." Lee replied that he shared the opinion, and then in December, Lee put an even harsher appraisal into a letter to General Horatio Gates. I'm quoting, "Entre nous, a certain great man is most damnably deficient. Unless something which I do not expect turns up, we are lost." Now, one might expect that these accusatory sentiments might have been widely shared. Few societies are tolerant of military failure. Just within the previous 20 years, a British admiral, Admiral Byng, and a French general, Lally de Tollendal, had both suffered the ultimate penalty for the unpardonable crime of losing. They'd both been executed. General Lee might reasonably have expected himself to float upwards on a tide of public disillusionment that would still simultaneously engulf the man apparently responsible for the American reverses, namely George Washington. But here's a remarkable thing. Despite the scale and severity of the problems that the American army was facing in this period, not only did George Washington's reputation in the general public not suffer, to the contrary, it flourished. From the moment Washington had taken command of the army in July of 1775, he had been greeted with a virtual torrent of adulation. Ships were named for him, at least 15 by the end of 1776. 6 towns in the colonies were named for him. Children were named for him. Printed portraits of him were appearing in thousands of copies, some but not all based on the 1776 Charles Willson Peale portrait. Versions even appeared on handkerchiefs. Harvard gave Washington an honorary degree. And when he arrived in New York in the spring of 1776, more people turned out to see him than had ever gathered together in the city. Already in 1775, Jonathan Mitchell Sewell had composed verses to be sung to the tune of the British Grenadiers, whose chorus ended with praise for glorious Washington, great Washington, even godlike Washington. Phyllis Wheatley, the enslaved African-American poet, hailed Washington with words that would actually make him decidedly uneasy by seeming to promise him a monarchy. To quote, "A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine." In 1776, in mid-1776, a New Jersey family rewrote the anthem God Save the King with the words God Save Great Washington. These works enjoyed great popularity, reprinted often in the newspapers, and the disasters of 1776 did nothing to stem the flood. The desperate autumn of that year saw the publication of yet more adoring poetry, expressions of support, portraits, a play called The Fall of British Tyranny that featured Washington as a heroic lead character. Even as a defeated and depleted Continental Army fled across New Jersey, American newspapers seem to have published almost no lines of serious criticism of the commander-in-chief, certainly nothing to compare with the complaints privately voiced by John Adams or Reed or Lee. None of the other generals in the Army enjoyed anything like Washington's reputation. And then, of course, once the tide had actually turned at the Battle of Trenton and then at the Battle of Princeton in January of 1777, the flood of praise became a virtual tsunami. Let me quote the delegate and poet Francis Hopkinson, writing in the Pennsylvania Journal in February 1777. Quote, "The title of excellency is applied to Washington with the greatest propriety. If there are spots in his character, they are like spots in the sun, only discernible by the magnifying powers of a telescope. Had he lived in days of idolatry, he had been worshipped as a god. One age cannot do justice to his merit." Now, of course, during the war years that followed, there was plenty of criticism of Washington, much of it stemming from Republican suspicion of standing armies and their too popular commanders. But it is still the case that this criticism was most often swamped by the tide of hero worship. Now, given the contrast between Washington's very real difficulties, plus the private criticisms of him on the one hand, and then the huge public adulation on the other, I think it's fair to say that John Adams was not, in fact, simply expressing jealous resentment when he spoke of the idolization and superstitious veneration of George Washington in early 1777. He was not entirely wrong many years later when he spoke of Washington as a character of convention whose reputation had been deliberately inflated to serve as an inspiring symbol of national unity. But all of this raises the question of why. Why was it that so many American revolutionaries seemed to focus their hopes so intently on this man, a general in uniform? I would submit it was actually a somewhat strange move for this of all revolutions, in this of all revolutions, given the intense suspicion of standing armies that had contributed so deeply to the break with Great Britain. Remember the charges against George III that Congress had included in the Declaration of Independence in July of '76. Quote, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Yet just 7 months later, in February, that same Congress was considering whether to surrender its own power to name officers to the commander-in-chief, George Washington, prompting Adams's original outburst about idolization. Now, the most obvious answer to the question of why the revolutionaries might have fixated on Washington the way they did is that they saw in him a substitute king. Excuse the cartoon there, couldn't resist. And of course, there were elements of this, from Phyllis Wheatley promising him a crown and a throne, and the singing of God Save Great Washington to the tune of God Save the King. And we could look a few years later to poor Colonel Louis Nicola of the Continental Army. He was the man who urged Washington to declare himself king in 1782. And for his pains, he earned one of the strongest rebukes Washington ever uttered. Recent trends in the historiography of the American Revolution, a couple of titles here, have made us more sensitive than ever to this evidence. Brendan McConville has stressed that what he calls an intense admiration for the monarchy in the all-encompassing royal America that existed before the Revolution, that this has to be taken into account. Eric Nelson has gone so far as to call the revolution, you can see here, a royalist revolution, a rebellion in favor of royal power. From Nelson's point of view, it was only King George III's decision to side with Parliament over issues of colonial taxation that extinguished the love the colonists had felt towards the British monarchy, and he also argues that soon after America achieved independence, it sought to recreate that monarchy under another name, namely the American presidency. But these arguments only take us so far. Even Eric Nelson, of course, has to acknowledge that there was, in fact, a moment of intense revulsion, not simply against George III, but against the institution of monarchy that accompanied and drew powerful reinforcement from Tom Paine's common sense. Can't resist quoting a little Paine, always very quotable. But where, says some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friends, he reigns above. It is sinful to acknowledge any being under that title of king than the Lord of hosts, said Tom Paine. And it wasn't Paine alone who reflected explicitly on the institution of monarchy at the start of the Revolution and hoped to create an American republic that would function without a king. But it's precisely at this moment of greatest revulsion towards monarchy as an institution which was also the greatest moment of peril for American arms, that the cult of Washington began and then floated rapidly upwards like an untethered balloon. If we're to understand this phenomenon, I think we have to acknowledge that in the American imagination, in fact, Washington was very different from and greater than a king. Again, I think it's significant that Adams, in February of '77, did not accuse Congress of trying to make Washington a king. He spoke of idolization, superstitious veneration, suggesting that Washington was being seen more in religious terms. And Francis Hopkinson, again in a more positive vein, adopted exactly the same language. Just to repeat, had Washington lived in the days of idolatry, he would have been worshipped as a god. So something other than royalism was at work here. Now, in trying to get at what that something was, I'd suggest it's actually useful to go back to the concept of charisma, a concept which in the social sciences was originally defined by Max Weber, and has been much discussed ever since. The word itself has very strong religious connotations. It means a gift of divine grace. Weber deliberately intended these connotations because he saw charismatic figures as objects of worship, as men who were seen as supernatural, at least in some respects. I don't suppose there's any way to stop. I can barely read this, actually, sorry. I'll try to move over here a little bit just so the sun isn't. No, it won't. Anyway, yeah, I'm just going to move this over so the sun is not. I mean, the divine light shining in. No, I don't think so. In any case, Weber, I think, is really, is of course is an absolutely wonderful analyst of this. Weber, he distinguished charismatic authority from traditional patriarchal authority and kingship. Also very useful, I think, for understanding the kind of worship that we have here in Washington. He was also, of course, distinguished it from modern bureaucratic authority. Weber saw charisma not as an intrinsic quality of the charismatic leader, not as simply something projected from inside, but rather something generated in large part by the expectations and hopes of the followers. And he argued, of course, that charismatic authority arises out of the direct emotional relationship between the charismatic figure and the people who follow him. He argued that it's explicitly anti-traditional and revolutionary. He uses the word revolutionary. And I think all of these things fit the adulation of George Washington very, very well. And finally, interestingly, Weber saw charisma as something that by its nature is untrammeled and unrestrained. It can't easily be contained within any sort of constitutional structure. And I would suggest, again, I'll come back to that theme in the way it relates to Washington. And I'd suggest that these attributes of charisma indeed fit very nicely, again, with the way that Washington was seen in the early years of the American Revolution. But I'd also suggest something else. If Washington's charismatic image was able to develop in the way it did, it was in part because there were precedents for it. Charisma is an historical phenomenon. It develops in particular ways in particular contexts. In the 18th century, the context that mattered was above all the context of print culture. Newspapers and pamphlets, novels, printed engravings, and much else. And in my current book project, I'm arguing that within the prodigiously expanding print culture of the 18th century Atlantic world, there did in fact emerge a new, historically specific form of charisma attached to particular figures who were seen as being possessed of absolutely supernatural abilities, who were seen as anti-traditional, who were seen as revolutionary. And they were also figures with whom ordinary readers were able, through print, to imagine having a direct emotional bond. There are figures in whom these readers were ready to place almost unlimited trust. George Washington was would turn into the single most important of these figures, but he did have predecessors around whom the phenomenon coalesced before he came on the scene, and who in a sense prepared the way for him. So let me introduce you to the first of my two Corsicans, namely Pascal Paoli. Now, Pascal Paoli is a figure largely forgotten today, at least outside of Corsica, where he's very strongly remembered. He was born in Corsica in 1725, but he left at an early age when his father joined an initially unsuccessful rebellion against the power that ruled Corsica, which was the Italian Republic of Genoa. In the mid-1750s, having trained as a military officer in the Kingdom of Naples, Paoli returned to Corsica, where the rebellion was still stuttering on. He quickly rose to command the rebel forces, and he won several important victories over the Genoese and effectively liberated the island from them. For the next decade or so, he ruled as the unchallenged general-in-chief of Corsica. He wrote a constitution for the island. He founded a university. He carried out a series of other reforms that attracted a great deal of notice throughout Europe. British Whigs and French philosophes alike seized on Paoli as a symbol of liberty. Engravings of him proliferated. You see one of them here, as did newspaper accounts, poetry. In some British novels from the late 1760s, characters speak casually of going a volunteer under the brave Paoli, much the way Britons of the 1930s would speak of going to fight in Spain. Now, much of this vogue, interestingly, can be traced to a single source, namely the writer James Boswell, the biographer known as the author of The Life of Johnson. Boswell actually spent 2 weeks visiting Paoli in 1765. He published a breathless account of the trip and of Corsica, you see here the title page, that became a European bestseller and actually launched Boswell's own literary career. I would call Boswell's book the single most important and influential one for shaping the literary image of the charismatic revolutionary founder in the 18th century. Interesting fact that Napoleon Bonaparte, another Corsican, learned about Paoli, his compatriot, primarily from an Italian translation of Boswell's book. Now, it's true that Paoli's star faded very rapidly. In 1768, France bought the rights to Corsica from Genoa, and France sent in its own army to occupy the island. Paoli had done very well against the Genoese. He did much less well against the modern professional French military, and he went down to quick defeat. He ended up in exile, in fact, in London, where he became part of the literary and social circle of James Boswell and Samuel Johnson. He had a lot of money, and he bought a big house, and he entertained very sumptuously there. Johnson liked that very much. Paoli would return briefly to Corsica during the French Revolution. He would briefly lead another fight for independence, but he would lose again. He was defeated. He died in exile in London in the early years of the 19th century. But for a few years in the 1760s, Pascal Paoli was one of the most admired and talked about people in the Atlantic world. Virtually all of these accounts stressed his apparently supernatural qualities, which distinguished him in the view of these panegyrists from almost all other men. He was seen, first of all, as possessing a kind of extraordinary virtue of a sort that no longer existed elsewhere in the world. William Pitt the Elder himself said of Paoli, "He is one of those men who are no longer to be found but in the pages of Plutarch." The most popular English language poem about Paoli called him the last great epitome of Roman virtue or Athenian fire. The writers dwelt at length on his success as a mighty man of war, leading ragtag partisans to victory against Genoa. And they also did not fail to comment on his physique, yet another remarkable factor about him. Boswell called him tall, strong, well-made, of a fair complexion, a sensible, free and open countenance, a manly and noble carriage. And Boswell went much further, as Boswell usually did. He endorsed Paoli's comparison of himself to Judah Maccabee, no less, and Boswell added comparisons of his own to many heroes of Roman and Greek antiquity. He called the Corsican a man who just lives in times of antiquity. He even mused that until meeting Paoli, he himself had believed that such a man could not possibly exist, and I'm quoting, "no more than seas of milk or ships of amber." He concluded that in Paoli I saw my highest ideal realized. He also argued that Paoli had been virtually deified by his own people. And here I'm going to quote Boswell. "Paoli sways the hearts of his countrymen. Their love for him is such that although the power of his office is properly limited, in fact, the power of Paoli knows no bounds whatsoever. It is high treason so much as to speak against him. His rule is a species of despotism, but founded, contrary to the principles of Montesquieu, not on fear, but on love." For Boswell and for many other admirers, Paoli was no ordinary ruler. He was the father of a nation who hoped to form the Corsicans into a new people. But even as these authors presented Paoli as basically a kind of idol, they also did something else. They did everything possible to imagine readers, to help readers imagine a personal, intimate connection with him. Boswell again provides the best examples. For example, he wrote, "One morning, I remember, I came in upon Paoli without ceremony while he was dressing. I was glad to have an opportunity to see him in those teasing moments when, according to the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, no man is a hero to his valet. It wasn't as much of a cliche in the 18th century. When he was revising his first draft for publication, Boswell cut out anything that might reflect badly on Paoli, but he left in what he called small peculiarities of character, like Paoli's apparent inability to sit still for more than 5 minutes. Many parts of Boswell's book also adopted the style very much of a sentimental novel of the period, such as, for example, his imagined description of the moment when Paoli left his father in Naples to return to Corsica. I'll quote, "The old man, hoary and gray with years, fell on his neck and kissed him, gave him his blessing. 'My son,' said he, 'I may possibly never see you more, but in my mind I shall be ever present with you.'" This lines could have appeared in any one of about 10,000 18th century novels. Overall, the image of Paoli in Britain was in fact so much that of a literary character, interestingly, that Paoli himself felt the need to stress the difference in a letter that he sent to several British newspapers. To quote Paoli this time, in a letter that appeared in the Morning Chronicle, "My character has not been that of a hero of romance, a Quixote or an Amadis. There's nothing more real than the objects I pursue. So give me money," was what he basically added. The engravings of Paoli, such as the one that I showed here, also served the same purpose of helping ordinary people imagine actually seeing him, having a personal relationship with him. In Britain, he very much became a kind of household name. A ladies' magazine published a recipe for chicken Paoli, and the sporting press tracked at least 4 racehorses named Pascal Paoli. He was, in fact, very much what we would now call a celebrity. And as the French historian Antoine Lilti has recently reminded us, the modern phenomenon of celebrity very much is born in the expanding print culture of the 18th century. And the cult of Paoli, if we can call it that, did not remain limited to Britain. Very quickly it spread to British North America. Perhaps not surprisingly, as a symbol of resistance to despotic colonial rule, Paoli had a rather obvious appeal to America's proto-revolutionaries, even more than he appealed to British Whigs. Between 1755 and 1775, his name appeared in American newspapers some 2,000 times. These newspapers reprinted at least 6 times the most prominent Whig poem about Paoli. At least 8 times they reprinted Paoli's own most important public letter to the British press, including one time in 1776 with explicit reference to the growing American Revolutionary crisis. A long summary of Boswell's book appeared in an American almanac. The editor of the New York Journal proclaimed Paoli the greatest man on earth. John Hancock named one of his ships the Paoli. A number of unfortunate Americans grew up with names like Pascal Paoli McIntosh and Pascal Paoli Levens. A tavern outside of Philadelphia eventually gave its name after a small military engagement there to the town that is now called Paoli, Pennsylvania, which is the first of at least 6 communities with this name in the present United States. So, having laid this out and talked at length about this Corsican, let me now turn back to George Washington. Because it seems to me that if we look at the way his reputation developed, it's striking just how much it paralleled the earlier cult of Paoli. With Washington as well, he was praised for his virtual superhuman qualities. Virtue, of a sort that had supposedly died out with classical antiquity. One could quote things almost at random about Washington. A widely reprinted newspaper article, for example, of early 1777, compared him to Aemilius, Fabius, Hannibal, and Caesar, and concluded, "Let not the name of Brutus or Camillus be remembered, whilst that of Washington is not to be found in the annals of America." By 1783, Ezra Stiles was claiming, and I quote, "Washington convinced the world of the beauty of virtue." Washington's first biographer, John Bell, no relation, claimed that in 1779, no man ever united in his own person, it was a very short biography, in his own person a more perfect alliance of the virtues of a philosopher with the talents of a general than George Washington. It was widely noticed that Washington adored Joseph Addison's play Cato, frequently quoted it, and liked to compare himself to one of its virtuous heroes. Throughout his career, Washington's admirers also rarely failed to note his extraordinary physical attributes, both in print and in private correspondence. The words manly and graceful occur ubiquitously, as do mentions of the fact that he really was very tall. He had perfect posture and no less perfect self-command. The authors often thought it worthwhile to give a detailed physical description. John Bell, in this case, was typical. General Washington is a tall, well-made man. His features are manly and bold, his eyes of a bluish cast and very lively, his countenance sensible, composed, and thoughtful. There is a remarkable air of dignity about him, with a striking degree of gracefulness. The many portraits by Charles Wilson Peale including the two now at Princeton commemorating the Battle of January 1777. I think Nassau Hall is in the background of one of these. Conveyed these qualities brilliantly well before Gilbert Stuart came on the scene. Peale, who first painted Washington in 1772, liked to tell stories about his subject's exceptional physical strength. These physical attributes, indeed, or the descriptions of them, were even held to awaken some fairly dramatic physical responses. The Virginia lawyer, St. George Tucker, described the scene when the Marquis de Lafayette was reunited with Washington at Yorktown. Lafayette, and I'm quoting, "He caught the general round his body, hugged him as close as it was possible, and absolutely kissed him from ear to ear with as much ardor as ever a lover kissed his mistress." Another French admirer wrote of Washington after the war, "When you see a portrait of this most famous hero, do you feel your chest tremble under your hand? Does your eye grow wet with sweet and precious tears? Do your cheeks flush with the fire of admiration?" Now, of course, these are typical expressions of 18th century sentimentalism, but that's exactly my point. Sentimental writing aimed at eliciting strong physical and emotional reactions that were not indeed without a sexual component, and Washington's admirers naturally drew on this literary genre when they described him. And it's worth noting that the sort of self-command that was always associated with Washington was considered a central attribute of American masculinity in this period. It almost goes without saying that despite the disasters of 1776 and later not entirely glorious encounters like Brandywine and Germantown, Washington was nonetheless everywhere praised as a military genius. John Bell, again typically claiming nature has given him extraordinary military talents, I may venture to pronounce that George Washington will be regarded by mankind as the greatest military ornament of the present age. So perfectly did Washington seem to fit the model of the ideal commander, in fact, that it even dominated accounts of him in the British press. To quote Troy Bickham, who's closely studied Washington's image in the British newspapers, throughout the American Revolution, the press in Britain portrayed the commander of the rebel army as the model of citizenly virtue and the ideal military leader. Not surprisingly, just to continue the connections with Paoli, such a perfectly masculine and heroic figure quickly earned praise as the father of his country, in the sense not simply of taking tender care of the country, but in the sense of actually being its progenitor. The phrase was first applied to Washington as early as 1778 in a German-language Pennsylvania almanac, des Landesvater, the father of his country. The playwright Royal Tyler said Washington was, quote, not childless, but the parent of millions, like Christ. And like Paoli, Washington received credit for forging his people into a new nation, was frequently labeled a second Moses. John Bell, again in another typical burst of hyperbole, compared him not just to Moses, but to Camillus, Leonidas, Gustavus Adolphus, Hampden, and Sidney, and then added, but these illustrious heroes, though successful in preserving and defending, did not, like Washington, form or establish empires, which will be the refuge or asylum of liberty banished from Europe by luxury and corruption. But despite being seen as possessing all these superhuman qualities, Washington was also, in his way, a very familiar figure to Americans, someone with whom it was possible to imagine a kind of personal relationship. There were the children and ships named for him, the poetry and songs, especially the images that circulated in massive numbers throughout the states. Unscrupulous printers produced thousands of portraits, supposedly done from life, clearly not, as you can see, or some were based on the Peale portraits of 1776 and 1777. They could be found in books, magazines, children's primers, sheet music, banknotes, textiles, and ceramics. Washington was, like Paoli, a celebrity again, in many ways the greatest American celebrity ever. Now, Washington himself certainly resisted one particular element of celebrity very strongly. He insisted on formality. He had a positive horror of excessive familiarity. I can't resist here quoting the famous lines of Nathaniel Hawthorne on Washington in a famous passage which bears, in a wonderful passage where Hawthorne wrote, "Did anybody ever see Washington naked? It's inconceivable. He had no nakedness, but I imagine was born with his clothes on and his hair powdered and made a stately bow on his first appearance in the world." Washington could certainly address ordinary soldiers with warmth, but he resisted any kind of intimate glimpse into his private life. He did everything he could to deny an American Boswell the chance of observing his toilette. Not surprisingly, maybe in the 1770s, most of the accounts of Washington's private life didn't appear in America. They appeared in Britain, where this particular mechanism of celebrity was better developed. Most of it was just made up, of course, like stories about his love affairs, or a report that his daughter escaped to England after the death of her lover, a loyalist, at the Battle of Long Island. Of course, he never had a daughter. But over the next 2 decades, the United States would catch up with Europe when it came to turning leaders into celebrities. And once Washington died in 1799, the floodgates opened. The great man had scarcely been entombed in Mount Vernon when the itinerant parson and huckster Mason Locke Weems, who's been well studied in connection with Washington by Francois Furstenberg, who's here, Weems published a breathless, adulatory biography that pried deeply into Washington's private life, again happily making most of it up, including the famous story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree as a young boy. Weems's writing mixed the style of the sentimental novel with the preaching of the Great Awakening, a dash of Plutarch thrown in for spice, and all of it reading rather like it was composed on LSD. And the author forcefully defended his intrusive approach. I'm quoting Weems, "It is not in the glare of public, but in the shade of private life that we are able to look for the man. Private life is always real life," wrote Parson Weems. Now, I don't mean to suggest in what I've been saying here that Pascal Paoli and his admirers were responsible for the reputation of George Washington in the early years of the American Revolution. I think in some ways Paoli did prepare the ground. I can cite at least partial evidence for this claim by noting the fact that as late as 1780s, newspapers in New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York were reprinting yet again the most prominent Whig poem that had been written about Paoli 15 years before. And they added this note of explanation, I quote, "The character of the above General Paoli and that of our illustrious Commander-in-Chief are so similar that the following selected lines made on Paoli are well adapted and very applicable to the other. Only for the words Corsica and Paoli, substitute America and Washington." But that's a small piece of evidence. What I'm really suggesting more fundamentally is that these two men formed part of a common Atlantic pattern. They both responded to the needs of an increasingly secular, critical public for heroic figures whose stature did not derive from a royal inheritance or from religious sanction, but rather from their own extraordinary but natural qualities. They responded to the needs of this public for heroes with whom they could imagine actually forging a direct emotional connection. I don't have time to speculate in detail here on why this need arose, but I would suggest that at least in part, in this age of revolutions, it derives in part from the anxieties generated by practices of political representation, which could place men and women under the rule of people they themselves had not chosen, whom they might have actually voted against, and whom they certainly didn't know personally. A charismatic figure like Washington was someone you could trust much more than an ordinary politician. And this need for a charismatic leadership figure was, of course, also fundamentally shaped by the literary culture of the day, above all by the genre of the novel, which similarly helped readers imagine intense personal relationships with characters that they were reading about on the page, possibly from quite different social stations from their own. As literary historians have always noted, the 18th century novel could indeed elicit extraordinarily intense emotional reactions from their readers, who would treat the deaths of their favorite characters like the deaths of close family members, or often worse. The historian Lynn Hunt has famously argued that 18th century novels in fact helped promote the development of the idea of human rights by teaching people to recognize people very different from themselves as fully human. My own argument here is somewhat different. I would say that by teaching people to imagine intense emotional bonds with characters who existed for them only on the page, it in fact, in a sense, trained people to imagine these emotional relations of complete trust, and therefore, in fact, of complete subordination, with political leaders who lacked the legitimacy that came from royal descent or from religious blessing, or even potentially from constitutional sanction. It's worth again recalling the extraordinary words of James Boswell here about the power of Paoli knowing no bounds. His rule is a species of despotism founded, contrary to the principles of Montesquieu, not on fear, but on love. The charismatic figure, the charismatic leader, was someone fundamentally beyond all rules. And this quotation brings me to the final point that I want to make today, which is that just as George Washington was not the first example of the phenomenon of charismatic authority in the age of revolutions, he was hardly the last either. And the later examples bring into high relief an element of the story that does not appear so prominently with Washington. As we know, not only did Washington angrily dismiss poor Colonel Nicola's suggestion that he take a crown, Washington signally failed to take advantage of the opportunities that certainly presented themselves, especially just after the Revolutionary War, to establish any kind of personal rule in the United States, to become some sort of monarch or despot. He was always Cincinnatus, the leader who made his reputation, who gained power through the renunciation of power, as Francois Furstenberg has put it. He was not Caesar. But as Boswell's line suggests, it's actually in the nature of charismatic power to tend towards despotism, even if this despotism is, as in Paoli's case, a despotism that disguises itself through emotional popular acclamation. And in the 18th century, no single figure proved more adept at turning towards despotism in this manner than the man who seized power in France just a few weeks before the death of George Washington, namely my second Corsican, whom you probably guessed, Napoleon Bonaparte. And here too, there are some direct connections. When news of George Washington's death reached France, Napoleon quickly arranged an official mourning period and elaborate memorial ceremonies, all of them designed to highlight the similarities between Washington and himself, and therefore to cement his still very shaky power. The climax was a lengthy eulogy delivered by the poet Louis de Fontanes, which could not, you see the title page here, which could not resist praising Napoleon, in fact, for surpassing Washington in war. Fontaine said Washington was a very nice guy, but he wasn't as good a general as our own Bonaparte. Now, one principal difference between Bonaparte on the one hand, and then both Paoli and Washington on the other, is that Bonaparte, in fact, represents a different stage in the development of charismatic authority because he developed his own charismatic legend far more consciously than the other two. While Paoli and Washington certainly both had enormous concern for their reputations and their public images, Washington, as I mentioned, had a horror of familiarity, no desire to be a celebrity in the modern sense. Not Bonaparte. From the moment of his early military successes in Italy, he deliberately promoted himself in newspapers, in engravings, in sculpture, poetry, and stage plays. Once he took power in 1799, these efforts only increased exponentially. Even so, his own charismatic authority still rested on foundations very similar to Paoli's and Washington. First of all, it stressed, as in their case, his quasi-supernatural abilities, not his height, clearly. Not so much his virtue either, although you see there was in fact a newspaper founded in France by him called Journal of Bonaparte and Virtuous Men. But he was constantly compared to exemplars of heroic virtue from antiquity. And he was praised incessantly as a mental genius capable of rapid calculation, perfect memory, a gestalt-like sense of the exact way to maneuver scattered units in battle, and much else. And that was actually pretty correct. He never formally, to continue with the comparisons, he never formally took the title Father of his country, probably because his Bourbon predecessors had often used it themselves. But he was often referred to as such informally, and his propagandists and admirers also frequently called him the héros régénérateur, the hero who regenerated France, who literally gave it a new birth. And at the same time, he was very definitely, again, a celebrity. His image circulated everywhere, along with stories of his personal connection to ordinary soldiers. Even before he took power, at least 150 separate engraved portraits of him had been produced and sold throughout Europe. And obviously, again, many of them having no clue as to what he actually looked like, but that didn't really matter. The nickname that some of his men bestowed on him after he actually stepped in to help load a cannon at the Battle of Lodi, the Little Corporal, is itself significant here. You can't exactly imagine Louis XIV being called the Little Corporal. So Napoleon was, in fact, a very modern sort of celebrity with whom ordinary French people could imagine an intense personal connection. So, I hope it's been helpful to place George Washington in the company of these two Corsicans. On the one hand, I hope it's made Washington in some ways a less American figure for you, less exceptionally American, rather more like the other charismatic leaders of the Age of Revolutions, who all arose out of the same shared Atlantic Enlightenment literary culture. But in a different vein, I hope the talk may have also emphasized the ways that Washington was in fact very different from his charismatic revolutionary colleagues. Because of course, unlike Bonaparte, unlike Toussaint Louverture, unlike Simon Bolivar, whom I'm also writing about, Washington steadfastly resisted any temptation to become an American Caesar, a despot who might rule if only through love. Could he have done so if he wanted to? Even if I were a real Americanist, I wouldn't want to engage in that sort of counterfactual speculation. I just mean to note that in the eyes of his most fervent American admirers, the principal limits on his power were self-imposed, which is to say, in one sense, they were non-existent. We can be thankful that he himself never really challenged the limits on his power the way Bonaparte did. For not only did Bonaparte destroy much of the legacy of the French Revolution, he left a disquieting legacy to future centuries in which it is proven difficult, even for the most committed democratic societies, to resist the lure of powerful, masculine, charismatic leaders. The United States has not gone down that path. George Washington set a powerful example that generations of American politicians, however flawed, have understood, at least up till now. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take some questions. I see a hand is already zoomed up there. So.
I'm going to turn off this video.
Yes, please darken. Here, I'll get.
Where can we steal those photoshops?
I just took them off the internet. If you, yes, please, question.
Hi, thank you. What a fascinating talk. I wish now there had been a musical written about Paoli. I wonder though with Washington, you know, he survived the onslaught of Republican criticism after his terms were over. Mm-hmm. But he also had the benefit of dying younger than most of the other founding fathers. Had he lived longer, do you feel he would have lost some of that luster, some of that celebrity that, or would it have mattered? He was, with all his accomplishments.
I'm always sort of uncomfortable with these counterfactuals. I mean, he did die very conveniently for his reputation, right? I mean, but you know, if he had survived into the Jefferson administration, if there would have even been a Jefferson administration with him still around, I'm not really sure. I mean, but no, I'm not really sure how to answer that. Yeah, Ethan.
Two Rhode Islanders, generals in Washington, Benedict Arnold and Nathaniel Greene.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's always someone behind the figure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Benedict Arnold, Nathaniel Greene being the quartermaster.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about the notion of the sort of person who's supposed to be in the wings.
I'm not sure exactly what you're getting
Well,
at.
you know, I mean, Washington obviously is the figurehead. I mean, you don't see a lot of portraits of Nathaniel Greene.
Some, but not as many, no. I mean, again, I think just for the.
Benedict Arnold, I don't know what, you know, where those are.
I mean, you know, I mean, I think it's in the nature of this kind of, you know, of sort of, you know, hero worship of a charismatic figure, that it has to focus on a single figure. It necessarily consigns the others to the wings. The same would be true with Napoleon, who was always, in fact, very chary with praise of his marshals, at least in public. Would sort of dismiss Ney and Murat and such. Washington often considerably more gracious, as he was a much more gracious person than Bonaparte. But still, I mean, I think it's in the nature of, I mean, this kind of phenomenon, which is really, you know, I'm not speaking of something which is created by Washington in any way. I'm speaking of something which is really bubbling up sort of towards him, and it would focus on him, so it wouldn't almost by definition focus on anybody else in his entourage to that same extent.
That's the very British nature of his heritage, because he was essentially connected to Spencers.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, he was as royalist as you could get. I mean, obviously he embraced Cincinnati,
Mm-hmm.
but he was a true royalist, in the true sense of the British. You know, he wasn't a German.
Oh no, he was. Well, again, I mean, I think that you know, what's interesting here is what is happening in American political culture. I mean, you know, there's, you know, as in all of these cases, I mean, and almost in the nature of celebrity, there's an image of the person which is, you know, very distinct from the actual person. The image that Americans had of Washington was not necessarily, you know, was not what Washington had of himself at all, and it's one of the, and so I mean, certainly there would be elements of this British royalist heritage that would come into the way that he would present himself. But I think one of the interesting things is the way that whatever his efforts, also Bonaparte's efforts, the efforts of these other people, the public discussion would always slip away from whatever they wanted. So in some ways, Washington did, I think, a much better job than some of the others, because he was not actually the subject of this kind of intrusive concern for his private life in his own lifetime. But then, of course, eventually, as soon as he died, like whomp, suddenly, I'm sure he would have been absolutely horrified by Parson Weems's biography. You can sort of, Weems ends with the kind of, maudlin scene of Washington being received into heaven. But you can imagine Washington in heaven sort of reading the book and going, oh, I need to send a lightning bolt down to strike this guy, right? Oh, yes.
You talked early on about there being essentially a campaign, a propaganda campaign, to build up this image. But you didn't talk about who was doing that and why. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little more.
That's a good question. I mean, my own sense is that, again, this is something which is not being directed in any sort of systematic way. With Bonaparte, yes. Bonaparte is a master manipulator, is a master propagandist. He understands how this is done. He founds newspapers, he commissions portraits, and so on and so forth. Washington is very concerned for his reputation. He has his portrait painted in these very dignified ways, but he's not the one, he's not commissioning the poetry about him. He's not. I do think this is something which is simply being generative of people who have this enormous need for a figure like him. A lot of it is being done through the newspapers. I don't know, Gordon, if you had,
Well, one of his aides was John Lawrence, a close friend of Hamilton.
Yeah.
Lawrence's father was the president of the Continental Congress.
Right.
Washington was very, very tied in, and he was an expert politician.
Oh, yes.
And used that connection to keep his enemies at bay. He had a group of followers, like Hamilton and Lawrence, who were very supportive of him. So he had his political fences mended all the time. He was very shrewd, because he had a lot of enemies.
Yes, no, absolutely. But I would still probably distinguish between, this kind of, very personal politics, which is happening in the Congress, and what's happening in the print culture, which strikes me as being different.
That was really what I was at.
Yeah.
Is there someone who was functioning as press secretary, who's pumping stuff out into the newspapers?
No, not
or newspaper people who were deliberately kind of seeding this stuff in the public press.
I don't think there's any evidence about that. I mean, perhaps later, but not in 1776 or 1777.
How do you shift from monarchy to this? I mean, you've made a distinction between a charismatic figure and a monarch, but there is a lot of emotional investment that people put into their kings.
Yes.
So that there are many people thought of Washington as a kind of king, a surrogate king. How do you distinguish the charismatic figure from the monarchical emotional connection that people have with monarchy?
I think you're absolutely right that there is probably some sort of surrogacy going on there. I mean, famously, Rip Van Winkle, he wakes up and he finds that the portrait of the king has been taken by portrait of Washington on the tavern, right? But I do think there's something to be said for there is a kind of traumatic moment of the early revolution, symbolized probably above all by the pulling down of the statue of the king in New York City, which is, it is a moment of revulsion, not simply against a particular king, but against an institution of monarchy that they see now as being revealed to them as being corrupt in some way. I mean, you know far better than I. I mean, the capacity of Americans at this time to sort of fear corruption, to see it everywhere. And my sense is that, in this moment of the revolution, they come to see the institution of monarchy as corrupt. They do feel the need for some sort of figure there, but I do think they see it as a fundamentally different figure. They don't call him a king. They refer to him as a deity, as a god. They're precisely looking for a language that expresses something different from monarchy, precisely because they now have this deep suspicion, this deep Whig suspicion, not simply of bad kings, but of kings in general, and they want to see something very different. So I would argue still that while some of this is undoubtedly a kind of transfer of the sort of emotional projection onto the figure of the British king, there is also something, there is a real political trauma that goes on in 1775-76, which represents a break with that, and that they look for something consciously different.
We have Jack, we have Marita,
Oh.
Francois, Dan, and
Oh boy. Jack didn't have a question. Francois, anything next? Or, oh, sorry. Or Rita, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great talk. The question I have is you've shown how Boswell is kind of creating a legend around the field. But I wonder, more generally, to what extent does the model of literary celebrity, to what extent does that model function for political figures? In other words, is Washington, benefiting from, that whole process of the new celebrities attached to writers, which developed in the second half of the
Oh, I think so very much. I mean, I didn't really have time to expound on this, but I mean, certainly to the extent that there is a kind of phenomenon of celebrity attached to this, it's one which develops, in a sense, first around writers and actors, people like David Garrick in Britain, Rousseau and Voltaire in France. I mean, the whole, sort of, again, the intense appetite for news about the private life. The political figures are different in some ways because they're not seen as, because they are seen as being sort of, in many ways, particularly by their virtue, being above the common, the common range of people. But even so, the great writers could be seen in this way as well. Yeah. So I think it's very much, what Lilty calls sort of les mécanismes de la célébrité, the mechanisms of celebrity that get developed in large part around literary characters that are transferred in this period to political figures. Absolutely. I mean, I've always wanted, there's another chapter of this, I wanted to, where I talk about Robespierre and the way that, a lot of this, latches onto him despite his desperate desire not to have it latch onto him. And I'm calling this, in homage to Robert Darnton, readers respond to Robespierre. So yes, absolutely.
I have one point and then a question. The point is that on the need to identify personally with Washington, I mean, I agree that that's there, but it seems worth noting that it never seems to quite succeed because, Weems starts out on this note, we need to get beyond the man, the public figure, we need to look at the private life, and, his book is a bestseller, but 30 years later, people are complaining that we've never gotten to the real Washington. I think it's Paul Lester Ford who has the premise, a century later that this is, we've never. I think he entitles it "The True George Washington." We don't know who the true George was, and then Marcus Cunliffe is still the man in the monument, so. And even I think what's his name, the Hamilton and Washington guy, Chernow. He even starts his, he's complaining that we've never gotten this guy. So, it's been 250 years and almost 250 years, everybody's still complaining that they've never quite gotten to the real Washington. So anyway, that's just a comment. The question is, I love the talk and it's terrific, and I buy that there's something peculiarly modern here in terms of charisma. But how do you explain then this continual turn back to the ancient figures? To references to Plutarch's life, to Caesar, to Brutus. I mean, what's going on with this turn to the classical world?
Thank you for both. I mean, I would say, just in reaction to the point you made, I would say that that's actually the absolute nature of celebrity culture. Absolutely, to say, that Jennifer Lopez is, you've never seen her before, right? I mean, but seriously, that is what celebrity culture generates. Every glimpse into the private life is insufficient. Therefore, you need another one. So I would say that this operates for George Washington as well. In response to the question, I think I think that this is a really important, sort of thing here, which I'm still struggling with a little bit. But I think the important point is that it's a reference back to the ancient figures, but always in a very historicized manner. It's not that we are returning to ancient times. It's not that we're all becoming heroes. It's that these are people out of time. That what matters in the reference is precisely that these are figures out of Plutarch who are actually walking the streets among us today in our own corrupt, imperfect modern world. So therefore, the stress is really on that contrast, which makes them even more unusual. But it's still very much that the context is a modern context. And I think that ends up being really the important point, and what how the reference serves really here, particularly in these sort of, when they're doing the hyperbolic comparisons of Washington to basically everybody who they find in Plutarch's table of contents. This is, it's to make that point that yes, he's like them, but yet he is among us today. So.
Thank you for your talk, and I'm sorry if I'm harping on something that's come up in some of the other questions, but I'm fascinated with the way that you cited this emergence of celebrity within English print culture, and as somebody who spends far too much time looking at the print culture production of celebrity or production of kingship among the late Valois and the first Bourbon king, particularly Henri IV, I'm struck by how much these techniques are continuous. Particularly the going back to the ancients, of course the Père du Peuple, as you mentioned, and I'm wondering to what degree, first of all, whether you've looked at the context of French print culture in relation to Washington, given the context of this talk, and secondly, to what degree, well, I've lost my secondly.
No, I mean, thank you. No, I mean, just a quick note on the phrase Père du Peuple. This is a very interesting phrase because there are two very different meanings that it can have. So the French kings routinely refer to themselves as the Père du Peuple. Louis XII, Louis XIV, all the Louis are Père du Peuple. But what this means is that they are like the fathers who take tender care of their families. But when it is used about Washington, the father of his country, it's not used in that sense. It's used in the sense of somebody who actually is the progenitor of the country, and that's clearly the way that it's used with Washington. I think that there are definitely roots of this of course there are, in the attitude taken in the propaganda towards kings, very much so. But I do think, again, that there's a twist here, that there's a break in some fundamental ways. And I think actually one of the most interesting ways here, which I didn't have time to go into today, but which I'm doing in the book, is looking at the way in which certain monarchs themselves have their images transformed in the 18th century. And one of the figures who's actually enormously popular, interestingly, in British culture, print culture, in French and German, not so much in America, is Peter the Great of Russia. A very fascinating figure, the way that he is imagined in these countries. I mean, lots of people, Daniel Defoe writes a biography of him, Fontenelle writes about him, Voltaire writes a long, writes a great deal about Pierre le Grand. And what they all do is they actually stress his difference from other monarchs. Because they say he really does create his country anew. He's not just ruling Russia, but he's actually making Russia. They say that they stress they stress his natural attributes. Again, which I think is very important. This is done in some cases with some monarchs, Henri IV in particular, but not always to the same extent. I mean, and again, there's a kind of sense of familiarity which is stressed, which is not stressed with the monarchs. That is something, again, this element of celebrity of the monarch as being somebody who, you could sort of imagine, in the American phrase, having a beer with, is not something you could do. Maybe with Henri IV to a certain extent after his death, not during his. Particularly after his death, but not during his reign. So there are continuities. Yes, I don't want to stress the absolute break, because obviously there are continuities here, but it's not simple continuity. Right. We can't understand the story if we say this is simply, the regurgitation of the way that people have related to monarchs forever. This is a revolution. There's something new going on here.
Yeah. Final question, Ben?
And Gordon, I think, wanted to come in too. Ben and then Gordon.
Ben and then
so you link Washington's demise with Napoleon's rise.
Yes.
But we're not just talking about two Corsicans, we're talking about two Corsicans, right? And that's got to be important somewhere too. So the fact that Napoleon becomes emperor of the French reads about Paoli, the other Corsican, and Italian. Could you tell us a little bit about Napoleon's vision of Paoli?
Well, that's very complicated because Napoleon grows up the son of somebody who ended up supporting the French side, and obviously therefore sends Napoleon to military school in France. Napoleon is very much a fish out of water in French military school, teased for his accent, his looks, etc. Becomes an incredible Corsican patriot. He goes into the French army saying that what he wants to do is lead a war of independence against France. Go figure. He idolizes Paoli, whom he reads about in Boswell. Then, comes the revolution. He writes Paoli this letter saying, General, I was you know, I was born as despotism was washing up on our shores. I worship you from afar. You know, then with the revolution, Paoli is able to come back to Corsica. With the revolution, Bonaparte goes back to Corsica. Quickly, they find out that in fact they hate each other. They compete for, Bonaparte wants to, you know, establish himself as an important figure. Paoli thinks of as an upstart. Paoli sends Bonaparte on an expedition to invade Sardinia. Paoli says to the men who are going with him, if Bonaparte doesn't come back, hint, hint, that's fine. You know. Then finally it comes to blows after Lucien Bonaparte, who is a great Jacobin, denounces Paoli. Paoli, there's a fight in Ajaccio, and the Bonapartes are actually kicked off the island in June of 1793, at which point Bonaparte lands in France just in time to become the hero of Toulon, establish his career, and tie his wagon forever to France. So it's a complicated relationship in the least, but Bonaparte in, here an interesting point, in the Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène, tells Lascaz, so in this, what he dictates, he says, you know, Paoli said to me once, you are like a man out of Plutarch. So even still, there's still this sense of this continuity through Paoli to the days of the ancients.
You mentioned the theater, which I think is a very important part of this. Washington very much loved the theater.
Yes.
And as Adam said, he was the best actor of a president we've ever had.
Yes, absolutely.
He was very self-conscious in building this image. His image was self-created. He had that model of what he wanted to do, what he wanted to be.
Yes.
So that, I think, and of course he loved the theater. He had to play
Addison's
play
Cato, of course, yes.
So I think that's a very important part of his charisma, if you will.
I do. I agree. This, I mean, again, I think it's very interesting that when we look at Washington's sort of self, the way he wants to be presented, he's thinking in theatrical terms, very much. And there's a tension between the theatrical, you know, way in which he would sort of, in which he's imagining himself, and the kind of novelistic way in which he may be seen increasingly, you know, among the public. Again, part of this tension. But yes, no, I agree with you entirely.
The real final question.
Well, just to pick up on Gordon's point, but the whole notion of persona is self-functioning, very important in the culture in which Washington grew up.
Yes.
And which, in a way, you could say that his persona is self-generated because of his limitations. He was a lousy speaker. Nobody listened to him in the House of Burgesses. And nobody expected him to create a raconteur, you know, but he was shy.
Yes.
The gift of silence.
Pardon?
And the gift of silence.
Yes, right. Exactly.
But
He
absolutely.
learned that earlier in the midst of a bunch of people who were a whole lot smarter than he was, and were in fact master politicians. And this, in a culture that had been developing with well-defined personas in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I was just going to say that in the sense he was self-fashioning himself. Well, I think it's important to think of heritage as running two ways. I mean, Washington produced a heritage, but he also inherited it.
Yes.
And that inherited heritage may have something to do with this. I mean,
I do, but I think there's a tension here, because if you think about, I mean, literally what is persona? Persona, the word literally means a mask. And self-fashioning in the sense that Stephen Greenblatt uses it, in the sense that you're using it now, is the sense of fashioning oneself to a particular model that you're emulating. And you know, in that sense, it's a kind of denial of one's individuality, because one is fashioning oneself to be like something else. But in the celebrity culture, the emphasis is all on the individuality of the person, so that, you know, on the sort of extraordinary individual nature of the person. So again, I see a kind of tension there between the way Washington is thinking of himself, which is very much exactly in these terms of self-fashioning. He's impressed by, you know, by the British officers he sees. He's impressed by the French officers who capture him at Fort Necessity. You know, he has these very much models that he wants to emulate. And then the way he's being seen, you know, in the public as a, you know, as a really very different kind of figure. So I think it's an interesting tension between, you know, sort of older and more modern forms of publicity, between older and modern forms of celebrity, really. But that's, you know, central to sort of the modern political notion of charismatic celebrity is, you know, a focus on the individuality of the person, not on how much he is in fact exactly like Cincinnatus or something, but on what makes him, George.
I can't resist asking, Mike, at the end of all of this, given the fact that your project actually deals with Bolivar and Toussaint Louverture, George Washington, which are all gargantuan figures to this particular place. What?
I'll come back.
Well, you should. And you don't have to answer this, but what the geography of this Atlantic space. We've talked a lot about the deep past and the immediate past, but what is the actual space doing for this culture of celebrity that is going to be linking these different kinds of figures who are all coming from extraordinarily distinct backgrounds?
It is, but again, in since this is really a story about print culture, it is a story of places with printing presses, which includes, Le Cap Français up to a certain point, and then not actually. It certainly includes Venezuela under Bolivar, but Toussaint Louverture is a good sort of limit case, because what's very interesting to me, I don't think it's actually possible to really recreate in any meaningful way the relationship he had with the former slaves who followed him. But it is certainly possible to recreate the charismatic reputation, legend that he had in, first among the French officers who served with him, and then the image of him which circulates throughout the Atlantic world, which was really the focus of my chapter on Louverture, because what the charisma might have meant, what charisma might have meant in a kind of Afro-Haitian context, I'm certainly not qualified to say. So
one of the greatest treasures of the John Carter Brown Library are two books with red covers. They are George Washington's handwritten account books from 1791 to 1799, the year of his death. And as you were giving your talk, I kept thinking back on those to think that if there's anything more mundane and prosaic, it is the account book listing all of the detailed ways in which George Washington was not, in fact, a celebrity, but involved in day-to-day interactions and engagements with people that he was coming across. So that is the other side, perhaps, of the story that you've told. But I think we can all agree that it's a fantastic story, and we all look forward to hearing and seeing and reading the results of the research. So thank you.